cleaning. Yes, I do the cleaning. Let's keep the...
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is IZYAN binti IDRUS. My matric number 279480. Today I would like to present about topic 5, Neoclassical School. The origin of Neoclassical School. Microeconomic thought of the marginalists was transformed into Neoclassical. Neo means new economics. The Neoclassical economics were marginalists in the crucial sense that they emphasized decision making and price determination at the margin. Neoclassical school is quite unique. Why is unique? Because they doesn't have 5 major questions like the other school of economic thoughts. They draw on ideas of their predecessor, which is classical and marginalist, and develop them further. The greatest figure in this neoclassical school is Alfred Marshall. And the second one, I want to tell you about the extension of economic analysis by neoclassical school compared to classical and marginalist school. Neoclassical school stress both demand and supply. Classical just focus on supply only, while marginalists focus on demand only. Several of neoclassical economists, which is Wixell and Fisher, took a far greater interest in the role of money in the economy than the earlier classical and marginalists. Neoclassical economists extend marginal analysis to market structures other than pure competition, pure monopoly, and duopoly. It's an imperfect competition market.
Assalamualaikum. Hi, my name is Ambia. Now, I want to tell you who is Alfred Marshall and Adam Smith. Plus, I will tell you a little bit about theory of value in classical school's perspective. First, Alfred Marshall was born on 26 July 1842 at Bermondsey, London, England. But as the saying goes, all living things will eventually die. And so he did. Unfortunately, he died on 13 July 1924. Back then, young Alfred Marshall rejected a scholarship that offered by a University of Oxford. Instead, he attended University of Cambridge, where he devoted himself to maths, physics, and economics there. For your information, Alfred Marshall was aided by a well-to-do uncle because his father simply being too poor to pay for his tuition at the University of Cambridge. Fun fact about Alfred Marshall, he always being hypercritical on his writing, and also he was a hypochondriac where he always concerned about his health. Now, let's move on to his contribution. Before anything, I want to let you know that Alfred Marshall was the greatest figure in neoclassical school. Why is that? Well, first, he was the best synthesizer where he combined the best economics thinking in classical school with marginalist school together and become neoclassical school. He is the one who popularized the modern diagrammatic approach to economics. Well, he was an expert mathematician. However, he only placed all the maths in footnotes and appendix. According to him, economics was defined as a study of mankind in the ordinary business of life. And he also stated that economics is not a body of concrete truth, but it is actually an engine to discover the concrete truth. Alfred Marshall said that economists is like other scientists. Economists collect, arrange, interpret, and draw the inference from facts. Economists also seek knowledge from the interdependence economic phenomena and also the cause and effect relationships. In addition, economic laws are social laws that relate to human conduct in which the strength of major motive can be measured by financial price. Alfred Marshall and others had developed microeconomics and said little about business cycle. In 50 years of writing, he produced 82 publications in total, including Principles of Economics and Industry and Trade. Alright, next is theory of value. So we are going to explain the different perspective theory of value between every schools in terms of market price of goods and services. So under this part, we are going to discuss about three persons that represent every school. So the first one is Adam Smith from classical schools. The second one is William Stanley Jevon from marginalist schools. And the last one is Alfred Marshall from neoclassical school. Alright, we are going to discuss about diamond water paradox in classical schools by Adam Smith. So there are actually two types of value: value in use (VIU) and value in exchange (VIE). So the definition of VIU, value in use, is the utility of some particular object, which means that things that have biggest or greatest value in use have frequently little or no value in exchange at all. For example, water, even though it is essential to our daily life. While value in exchange means the power of purchasing other goods which the possession of that object conveys, which means things that have frequently little or no value in use will have the greatest value in exchange. For example, diamond, even though it is not essential to our daily life. Still, Adam Smith failed to solve the diamond water paradox because he didn't understand about 1. Total utility and marginal utility, 2. The law of diminishing marginal utility. Next, laboratory of value. Adam Smith discussed his theory on value in primitive society and advanced society. He also argued that labor was the only resources got in primitive society, which means the quantity of labor required to make a good would determine its relative value. Basically, a value of a commodity who wants to be exchanged to another commodity is equal to the quantity of labor which enable the person who owns the actual commodity to purchase or command. So let's take a look at the Smith deer's beaver example. So suppose it takes 2 hours to trap a beaver and 1 hour to hunt and shoot a deer. So the value exchange in beaver equals to 2 deers or 2 hours of labor. This is because the first one shows that each deer requires only 1 hour of labor to harvest. Meanwhile, the second one, a person could use the beaver to command 2 hours of labor service. So, in primitive society, labor cost is equal to labor command. In advanced society, normally goods are exchanged for money or labor at a price that is sufficient to pay salaries, rent, and profit. So the real value of commodities are no longer be measured by the labor content in them, but it can be measured by the quantity of labor which it can be purchased or command. Moreover, the quantity of labor a commodity can buy exceed the quantity of labor embodied in its production by the total profits and rents, and it is equal to the labor command exceed the labor costs. Thank you.
Hi, I'm going to talk about Marginalist School by William Stanley Jevon. Jevon's on value theory explained how he solved the diamond water paradox by explaining 3 concepts, which are total utility, marginal utility, and law of diminishing marginal utility. Total utility is the total satisfaction a person receives from consuming a particular quantity of goods. Marginal utility is the additional utility a person receives from consuming an additional unit of the particular goods. Meanwhile, law of diminishing marginal utility is the marginal utility gained by consuming equal successive units of a good will decline as the amount consumed increases. Law of diminishing marginal utility explains that as the person consumes more and more of the products, the satisfaction or the utility will decrease. For example, let's say a person buying chocolates and the next day they buy more chocolate, but then they don't get more satisfaction and want to buy cookies instead. That's what I can say about the law of diminishing products. which is the more people consume, the less satisfaction they get. There is two statements stated that total utility of water is high because water is very useful. Meanwhile, total utility of diamond is low because diamond is not useful as water. There is one question: if total utility of water is higher than total utility of diamond, why not the price of water is higher than the price of diamond? For this question, we can say that price does not affect total utility but will affect the marginal utility. Marginal utility of water is less than marginal utility of diamond. This is because water is very plentiful, meanwhile diamond is scarce and not as plentiful as water. So for the next additional unit of water that people consume will give less utility rather than diamonds. People will rather choose the additional diamond rather than additional water. Next is Javan's opinion on the value of pearl. Do pearl have value because people need to die for them, or do people die for pearls because pearl have value? According to Javans, people die for pearls because of pearls have values. This is because to retrieve a valued commodities, which is pearls, people need to die for them. Since people die for them, pearls are valued by the customer and useful to the divers. So the buyers get a utility from them. So we can conclude that Javans de-emphasized demand utility as the significance determinant of price. According to Javan, cost of production determines supply, supply determines the final degree of utility, and final degree of utility determines value.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good day everyone. My name is Siti Nurhafiza binti SARUN with number metric 279564. Today, I would like to explain the value theory in terms of demand from the Neoclassical school, Alfred Marshall. First foremost, Marshall on the theory of value. As you can see the figure, he combined the best of classical economics with marginalist thinking, thus he producing Neoclassical economics. In addition, he stressed both demand and supply in determining the market of goods, services, and resources. Next, the implication of Marshall approach are interesting, which is the relationship among supply, demand, and price tend to produce certain results if they are allowed to work themselves out by themselves. But society also can influence the outcome if it so desires. Moreover, according to Marshall, demand is based on the law of diminishing marginal utility. Marshall introduced two important qualifications at this point. First, he pointed out that he was concerned with a moment in time which is too short an interval to consider any changes in the character and tastes of a particular person. For example, the more good music one hears, the stronger one tastes for it is likely to become. Marshall's second qualification of the law diminishing marginal utility concerns consumer goods that are indivisible. A small quantity of a commodity may be insufficient to meet a certain special want. The utility approach of the Marshallian system dealt with pleasure, pains, desire, and aspiration in incentive to action. How can we measure the utility? Marshall boldly said, with money. The earlier marginals said that strength of a person's preferences determines the amount of money the person is willing to spend to acquire some product. Marshall, however, turned the relationship around so as to measure preferences according to financial scale of payments. For example, if shoes are twice as useful to you as a hat, you are willing to pay twice as much for shoes. Let's say 40 ringgit for shoes and 20 ringgit for hat. Because you are willing to pay twice as much for shoes as for the hat, we can conclude that the shoes yield twice as much utility to you. The next slide indicates rational consumer choice. Marshall demand analysis also employed the idea of rational consumer choice. In a money economy, said Marshall, each line of expenditure will be pushed to the point at which the marginal utility of a dollar's worth of goods will be the same as in any other direction of spending. Each person will attain this result by constantly watching to see whether there is anything on which he is spending so much that he will gain by taking a little away from that line of expenditure and putting it on some other line. Thus, for example, the consumer who must decide whether to buy new clothes or to use the money for a vacation is weighing the marginal utilities of two different types of expenditure. Jevons and Minger describe this process of rational choice here. Unlike these theories, however, Marshall successfully tied this EQ marginal rule directly to this contemporary law of demand. Last but not least, Marshall's law of demand follows directly from his notion of diminishing marginal utility in rational consumer choice. Marshall illustrates that the law of demand with both a table and a demand curve. In the long run, these determinants can change, and when they do, the entire demand curve shifts either leftward or rightward. Thus, Marshall had a clear conception in differences between changes in the quantity demanded, which is measured along the horizontal axis, and changes in demand, which shift of the entire curve. In formulating his theory of demand, Marshall chose to ignore the inconsistency he introduced by assuming that the purchasing power of money is constant. When the price of a product such as X falls, two effects are at work that increase the quantity purchased. Marshall focused on the substitution effect or the relative price effect, but when the price of X falls, an income effect also occurs. That is, the consumer experiences a gain in purchasing power. Last but not least, Marshall's law of demand follows directly from its notions of diminishing marginal utility and rational consumer choice. Marshall illustrates the law of demand with both a table and a demand curve. In the long run, these determinants can change, and when they do, the entire demand curve shifts either leftward or rightward. Thus, Marshall had a clear conception of the differences between changes in the quantity demanded, which is measured along the horizontal axis, and changes in demand, shifts of the entire curve. In formulating his theory of demand, Marshall chose to ignore the inconsistency he introduced by assuming that purchasing power of money is constant. When the price of a product such as X falls, two effects are at work that increase the quantity purchased. Marshall focused on the substitution effect or the relative price effect. But when the price of X falls, an income effect also occurs. That is, the consumer experiences a gain in purchasing power. Besides that, the law of demand is when the price goes up, the quantity demanded will go down. Next, we move to the consumer surplus. Consumer surplus refers to the differences between the total expenditure consumer are willing to pay and what they actually pay. Marshall asserted that the total utility of a good is the sum of the successive marginal utilities of each added unit. The price a person pays for a good not exceeds and seldom equals which consumers are willing to pay, rather than go without desire object. Furthermore, elasticity of demand. As I mentioned before, the law of demand is when the price goes up, the quantity demanded will go down. The elasticity of demand formula is the percentage change in quantity demand divided by the percentage in price. Lastly, I would like to explain the summary of the price elasticity of demand. The figure illustrates the type of price elasticity of demand. First, an elastic demand is one that shows a large fluctuation in the quantity demanded of a product in response to even a little change in another economic variable. The second one, an inelastic demand, is one that shows a very little fluctuation in the quantity demanded with respect to a change in another economic variables. An example of this can be petrol or diesel. Next, unitary elastic is one in which the fluctuation in one variable and quantity demanded is equal. A flatter curve will represent a higher elastic demand. Thus, the slope of the demand curve for a perfectly elastic demand is horizontal. Thus, the demand curve for a perfectly inelastic demand is a vertical line. That is, the slope of the curve is 0. That's all for me. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum, my name is NURUL binti AHMAD BORHANUDIN. My matrix number 279406. I will talk about the supply. Marshall said that supply is determined by the cost production. He divided into 3 time periods, which the immediate present, short run and long run. The immediate present is referred to the market price, with no time allowed for adaptation of the quantity supply to change in demand. It means that quantity supply cannot be increased immediately in response to a suddenly increased demand because it takes time for production to be curtailed, and also cannot be decreased immediately in response to decrease in demand. For example, a shop that sells shoes in Siti have increased in demand because they have a lot of customers need their shoes. Then they have to call the manufacturer to deliver the stock, and then so it takes time to deliver. Next, if a good is perishable, and we assume that the seller is trying to maximize profit or minimize losses, the market supply curve is perfectly inelastic. Next is short run. In short run, he divided costs into 2 types, which he called supplementary costs and prime costs. Supplementary costs are now known as the fixed costs, while the prime costs known as the variable costs. Fixed costs such as rental, insurance, and plant depreciation are constant because they cannot be changed in the short run. In fact, the short run is defined as that period during which the variable inputs can be increased or decreased, but the fixed plant cost cannot be changed. We move on into the long run. In the long run, all costs are variable and they must all be covered if the firm wants to continue in business. Then if the price rises shows that total revenue exceeds total cost of production, capital will enter the industry, typically through new firms. And then market supply will increase. So the entire supply curve will shift rightwards. While if the price fall below the average cost of production, capital will withdraw, probably by the exit of firms. So consequently, the market supply will decline, the supply curve will shift to the leftward.
For the example of the variable cost are raw materials, hourly wage, and the commission.
The table shows the amount each farmer or other seller offers for sale at any price is covered by his or her own immediate need for money and estimate of future prices. Assuming equality of bargaining power between sellers and buyers, the higgling and bargaining of the market will result in a price close to RM36 ringgit. Therefore, the price can be called the true equilibrium price because it will fix at the beginning and throughout. Furthermore, it would exactly equate the quantity demanded and supply 700 units. You guys noted that if the price were RM37 ringgit, a surplus of 400 units, which 1000 minus 600 of which would occur, and it would push the price downward. On the other hand, if the price were RM35 ringgit, suppliers would be willing to sell 300 fewer units of wheat than demanders desire. This shortage of yearlies would drive the price upward. And of course, the seller doesn't want to sell more units when the price falls because they doesn't want to get lost. They just want to get more profit. In the next slide is about the graph that shows the equilibrium of price and quantity, and also the consumer surplus and producer surplus. At the point E, we can see that the demand curve and the supply curve is intersect with each other,
And the quantity demanded equal to quantity supply, which is DD equal to SS.
What is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is the difference between the maximum price a consumer is willing to pay and the actual price they do pay. If a consumer is willing to pay more for a unit of the good than the current asking price, they are getting more benefit from the purchased product that they would if the price was their maximum willingness to pay. While for the producer surplus, is the amount of the producer benefit by selling at a market price that is higher than the least that they would be willing to sell for. This is rarely equal to profit since producers are not normally willing to sell at a loss and are normally indifferent to selling at a break-even price. And of course, if the consumer buy the products, it's about the satisfying of a product to use, while the producer is thinking about the profit, how to maximize the profit. I conclude from the figure Alfred Marshall that Alfred Marshall emphasized demand, utility, and supply cost of production as the significant determinant of price. He also introduced the concept of consumer and producer surplus. He also added the element of time in economic analysis and also illustrate the idea of the equilibrium price and quantity by using the table and graph approach. And for his opinion on the statement, do pearls have value because people need to die for them, or do people die for pearls because pearls have value? He says that both statements are correct. Pearls have value because people need to die for them, cost of production, and people die for pearls because pearls have value, buyers get utility. What can we summarize from all the three figures that we mentioned earlier is that Adam Smith, with classical economics, emphasized supply cost of production as the significant determinant of exchange value price, while Jevons, marginalist school, emphasized demand utility as the significant determinant of price, and lastly, the Alfred Marshall of the Neoclassical school emphasized both demand and supply as the significant determinant of price. That's all from our group. Thank you.